Our next guest is joining us from Canada. He's the executive director and co-founder of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, which was established in Canada in 1998. And in 2007, he became the chairperson of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition International. He's spoken at conferences all around the world, including Hope Ireland's inaugural conference back in 2015. He's also written the book, Exposing Vulnerable People to Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, which was published in 2012. So Alex Schadenberg, you're welcome back to Ireland.
I'm pleased to be with you, and my sound is fine.
It's good, thanks.
Excellent. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint slides. Great. And with information, I was told I'm going to be talking about the information related to what's happening in North America. Well, there's a fair amount of information related to North America, so obviously this is a big topic, and this is a very difficult person to follow as a presenter. To follow the last presentation is very difficult. Nonetheless, what we need to know about what's going on, I'm just going to give you some of the stats. Some of the stats that Laura already had mentioned, and this is important to point out that this does overlook. But the fact is that Canada is not actually producing up-to-date statistics, so it's very hard to follow this. And yet, at the same time, at this very moment, Canada is the best example, or in other ways look at it, the worst example of what you might call a slippery slope or incremental extensions, or just how would you say the law, which is just constantly growing. And the fact is that Canada legalized euthanasia in June of 2016, and it was euthanasia and assisted suicide, but in fact, almost all the deaths are done by lethal injection. So what we have then is, in a very, very short time, so in less than 4 years, our government introduced a new bill to expand the law. So when I show you the data that was shown, which is the same as what Laura showed you, there had been 13,946 medically assisted deaths, which is the term they like to use, or MAID term they like to use, by December 31st, 2019. We don't have the up-to-date data. I'm estimating, based on data I received from Ontario and a few other places, that there's been more than 21,000 already. We have grown incredibly fast in Canada, and it's a very sad story to say that. So what happened is that we're already talking about expanding the law. So we have a situation where the original law said that someone had to be terminally ill. It used this term that one's natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. But then in September, October of 2019, Quebec Superior Court decision in the Truchon case struck down the part of the law saying that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. So that means people wouldn't have to be terminally ill anymore. And they gave the government 6 months to change the law. In fact, the government has not finished that yet, and Quebec has just extended that decision, continues to extend that decision. But what was crazy is, of course, you don't have a review of the law that's happened. You have a lower court decision. The Superior Court is not the higher court, right? You have a lower court decision striking down a part of the law, and the government didn't appeal that. And I'm going to go on further with this. So now they're talking about this Bill C7, and that would remove that this natural death must be reasonably foreseeable in the law, which is the terminal illness requirement. But it was never really a terminal illness requirement, because the law never actually defined natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. They never defined that. So this was sort of a murky term that had multiple meanings. And because physicians might have different interpretations of that, it was interpreted very different, for instance, in British Columbia than it would be, let's say, interpreted in Newfoundland or Prince Edward Island. So the Bill C7 also expands this, that someone who's not capable of consenting, if they pass this bill, someone who's not capable of consenting could die by euthanasia if they had been previously approved. So what that means is, if someone has been approved for euthanasia, for lethal injection, and then let's say they had a stroke and now they're not capable of consenting anymore, the bill says they could go ahead and do the act. Bill C7 waives the waiting period. So currently the bill says there's a 10-day waiting period. Bill C7 would waive that waiting period, meaning that somebody who's been approved for euthanasia could die the same day. So as I say, this means a same-day death. Now, a lot of people haven't talked about this, but there's been a lot of research done on this whole question of the will to live. And a lot of that research was done here in Canada, actually, by a psychiatrist named Harvey Chochinov. His studies are worth reading, because he proves clearly that for almost everyone who says they want to die, their will to live will fluctuate. and he goes through significant research and data into that. So what this means, though, is if you get rid of the waiting period, one's bad day becomes their last day. The bill creates a two-track law. So the government said, well, if you don't have to be terminally ill, we'll have a 90-day waiting period for those who aren't terminally ill or who aren't dying, but we'll have no waiting period for those who, quote, quote, are dying. So it creates this, what you call a natural inequality within the law, that there'd be a 90-day waiting period. Now remember, the law allows euthanasia for physical or psychological suffering. Psychological suffering could be a type of mental illness or chronic psychological issues. So when you consider the Canadian healthcare system, and psychiatrists have been saying this over and over again, it often takes more than 90 days to get a referral for psychiatric care. And yet you could die within 90 days if you're not terminally ill, if you get approved for euthanasia. So that's a sort of a crazy dichotomy within the Canadian system if this bill passes. So what happened is the bill passed in Parliament, then it went to the Canadian Senate, and the Senate amended the bill. So the Senate then said, well, the bill doesn't actually go far enough. So they decided to amend the bill in several ways. One was they added that one could die for reasons of mental illness alone, so psychological suffering, but they said mental illness was a reasonable reason to die by euthanasia. Now remember, there's a 90-day waiting period if you're not terminally ill, but dying by mental illness alone. Now let's put this in perspective. In the Netherlands and Belgium, they do allow euthanasia for mental illness, but the protocol around the act, they stayed in their protocol, and the protocols, as you know, aren't always followed. We know that by the studies. Nonetheless, the protocol says that to do a euthanasia of someone, there has to be at least a 1-year period between the request and the death, and that the person requesting euthanasia for issues around mental illness or psychological suffering or chronic mental issues, that they must try all medical treatment. So in the Netherlands and Belgium, the protocol says that if someone says no to medical treatment or an effective type of medical treatment, that would be taken as also that they do not qualify for lethal injection. Whereas the Canadian Bill C7 says you wouldn't have to try medical treatment. If you want to die and you get approved, that would be fine. You could be dead within 90 days in the 90-day period. So what's going on in Canada is this whole thing is now being further debated, and it's going on, and I'm hoping in the end it all gets defeated. But the government is pretty committed to this concept of expanding the law. Now, I mentioned in the earlier slide, and I didn't go into it, the original law legalizing euthanasia had a little caveat in it saying that there had to be what they call a 5-year review of the law. And I guess they did that because there was quite a few members of parliament who were uncomfortable with euthanasia. So they said, well, if your concerns are correct, we will do a review of the law. And that review of the law was supposed to start in June of 2020. There has been no review of the law, and yet the government is considering expanding euthanasia to include mental illness alone, and yet there's still been no review of the law. They're now talking about reviewing the law after they expand the law, which once again makes no sense. So what's going on in the US? Well, the US, assisted suicide has become legal in quite a few states now. It's California, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, Vermont, Washington State, and the District of Columbia. So you have quite a few states that have legalized assisted suicide. And but what you need to know, which is a more important thing, is also legal technically in Montana. Montana, the law doesn't allow assisted suicide, but the Baxter court decision approved assisted suicide based on a defensive consent. So I'm not going to get into the particulars. What it means is assisted suicide is permitted in Montana based on a court decision. But assisted suicide bills are now being debated in almost 20 states right now this year in the US. And you have to understand that every year there's been about 20 states that have debated assisted suicide bills, and almost every year these bills get defeated. So for instance, you have the one year that California legalized assisted suicide, which is it's a massive state. So I understand that's a significant situation. Nonetheless, that same year, assisted suicide had been defeated in approximately 20 states. And for instance, in 2017, there was 26 states that debated assisted suicide bills, and all those bills were defeated that year. So when you consider this, it's not like everybody's just deciding we're going to legalize this. This is a major debate in the US right now. But what's also going on in the US right now is the expansion of assisted suicide. So when we're talking about data out of Oregon and Washington State, it's also important to talk about the expansion that they're talking about. So why am I saying this? Well, the other side says, well, there isn't any slippery slope. There's no reason to be worried. Look at Oregon, look at Washington State. There's no reason to be worried. But right now, at this moment, they've been expanding these laws. So they've said, well, we've had it legal for a while. It's time to expand it. So one of the ways they're expanding it is they're eliminating waiting periods. So for instance, the Washington State law has a 15-day waiting period, and they're planning to replace that with a 72-hour waiting period, but then they're saying that waiting period can be waived so that there would be no waiting period in certain circumstances. So they're also expanding who can do the act. So for instance, the Washington State bill for expansion, right now physicians can approve assisted suicide, prescribe the lethal drugs. Now they're going to expand that to include advanced registered nurses, nurse practitioners that is, and also licensed physician assistants. So this is totally different. They're also going to expand who can counsel. Now the laws don't require counseling, but when one's mental capacity is questioned. So for instance, in the state of Washington State, when a doctor would say that there's questionable capacity, then there's supposed to be counseling done in order to determine the capacity. Well, they're expanding, of course, who can do that counseling. This also, the Washington State bill will allow the drugs to be delivered by the mail. It could be delivered by etc. And I bring this up as an issue, not because, but what it means is that they're delivering lethal drugs, controlled substances through the mail to people to die by assisted suicide. And if you consider what's going on during COVID, when there's been a lot of lockdowns, a lot of people have been ordering their products over the mail, and they're receiving it, and it's being stolen from their doorsteps. And we know that this is a serious problem. Nonetheless, this is where they're going. We have to understand how these laws work. The existing approval system in all of these states, yes?
Sorry, Alex. Can you just wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
I can. So the existing reporting system and how it works in all these states, including Canada, is that, and in the Netherlands and Belgium, is that these are self-reporting systems. So the physician who approves the death can be the same physician who participates in the death, is the same physician who sends in the reports. So when we're talking about the reporting procedure and what's going on in these states, and they say we have effective oversight of the law, in fact, the oversight of the law is specifically designed to protect the physicians. So when Laura mentioned before that the law actually gives the power to the physicians to cause death, that's exactly what they do. You have to read the language of the bills, read the language of the law, and see what it actually does. The other side wants to sell this as my body, my choice, my freedom, when in fact the law is actually about giving physicians the right in law to cause death. I have quite a bit more information I could share with you, but there's not a lot of time. I'm happy to share my PowerPoint with anybody who contacts me. And Euthanasia Prevention Coalition is easy to find by Googling, etc. And my email is info@epcc.ca. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was a fantastic presentation, and amazing to see just the work you've done in tracking what's going on in the different countries. It occurs to me that societies have a big decision to make. It's we hear a lot of talk now about population inversion, possible global population decline in the second half of this century. And so I think it really is important that countries and societies work out where they stand on this issue, because it really is a central issue. And it's very interesting to hear not just where there is a slide in legislation or kind of a drift in legislation in some areas, but how many jurisdictions are repeatedly rejecting calls for assisted suicide.
So
now,
I think the key to all these things is that these laws and how they're written, because the fact of it is these laws are not written with clear language on purpose. When I refer to the Canadian law, they did not define the terminology on purpose in order to allow it to develop over time. But you see also this whole concept of how the law works is so important, because this affects how people are dying and how people are killing people. In fact, is what's happening.
Wow.
And I think that's essential. When I looked at your Irish bill, it's a bill that's not defined. So what's going to happen is it becomes, if you pass that, it becomes defined by its practice over time, which means it's expansive. And that's what happens. And that's what's happened in Canada.
So Alex Schadenberg of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition International, thank you so much for joining us today, and